Intriguingly, economic theory, I think one of the best examples of that was actually the phrase which came out of Ben Bernanke, trying to explain why economists didn't see the financial crisis coming back in 2007, 2008, and then saying that there was actually a failure of the engineering rather than a failure of the theory. I think it's completely arse about tit, to use an Australian expression. It was the theory that was wrong, and the theory is what guided policy prior to the crisis, and that policy actually made the crisis worse. And then in the aftermath, you had a lot of these academic economists criticising the policymakers for the mistakes they made, when if you read the theory, the crisis should never have occurred in the first place. And it was a complete failure of the theoretical framework of neoclassical economics to even understand that cycles could happen, let alone a crisis like 2007. And in that sense, the theoreticians created a model of the world which was almost, but completely, not quite, completely unlike the world itself, which then determined what the policymakers would do to try to make the world function better. So they would deregulate the financial sector. They would encourage private debt, which is probably my favourite, my explanation of where the crisis came from was a bubble in private debt, driving up a boom beforehand and then crashing in the crisis and causing a dramatic turnaround in aggregate demand. That was completely left out of the economic theory of the mainstream. The only person who developed that theory in an active way in the post-war period really was Hyman Minsky. And my main role was being an interpreter of Hyman Minsky and developing mathematical models of his verbal model of financial instability. But at the same time, he was ignored by the mainstream. In fact, Randy Ray, who's one of I think his last PhD student, said that Minsky used to shut his door when he gave lectures because he didn't want what he was saying there being overheard by his colleagues, I think at the University of Washington or some other university in the States, because they'd persecute him for his non-mainstream views, blaming the private sector for causing financial crises. So it was only the rebels who had an accurate analysis. The mainstream developed a theory in which these things couldn't happen, and then that theory is what guided what the policymakers did. So by speaking of a crisis, by the way, my chair has a failing pneumatic column, and as I talk, I realise I'm sinking. So pardon me doing a manual adjustment to my non-equilibrium system and getting back to reasonable height again. So the one way in which I'll accept this engineering versus theory division is, again, the point I made about how policy units like the OECD, like the Bank of England, like treasuries around the world, have to at least wear some of the consequences for making a mistake. And I'll use my favourite example there as your previous chief economist. I think his name was Oliver Coates. Is that correct? Coates is certainly his surname. And Coates in June of 2007 published in interim the OECD Economic Outlook, saying how the situation now is better than we've experienced in many years. Outlook is quite benign, and they predict a strong recovery and falling unemployment and rising economic growth for 2008. Now, I don't know what happened to Coates in particular, but I know from talking to people in the Bank of England who were giving similarly rosy predictions using neoclassical dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models about what a wonderful year 2008 was going to be. The product of that for a policymaker is they tell a politician this. The politician then stands in front of TV cameras and gets filmed saying how great next year is going to be, and I intend taking the credit for it. That's always the subtext, of course. Then they walk into an absolute catastrophe and they go back and say, what the hell was this prediction about? Why didn't you warn me? And in that situation, the economists who playing the engineering role use the mainstream theory to interpret with the data the mainstream theory directs them to look at to say what a great year 2008 was. Yeah. They get bashed around the head. And I'm not going to mention names. I'll just mention that one of the people I'm talking about has the same, one of his names is the same as one of my names in the Bank of England. Okay. And quite candidly said, we got it wrong.
Yeah.
Now, if you try to tie down an academic economist to saying we got it wrong, no, we didn't get it wrong. We just didn't predict the size of the exogenous shocks. And again, I will use the name there. It's actually a country you have some relationship with, an economist called Ireland, based in Boston, wrote a paper in, I think, 2009, 2010, looking back at the financial crisis through the lens of a DSGE model, and said, his prelude was to say that this was so different to what we expected that maybe this calls into question the whole use of these models themselves. And then he went through a DSG model and realised, he said, well, the crisis in 2007, I think it was the same as the crisis in 2010, because you could have shocks, and that's all that causes deviation from equilibrium in a DSG model. Shocks to technology and preferences were the same in both cases. It's just the case that in 2007, the shocks got bigger and lasted longer. I mean, come on, that is such an asinine explanation. Yeah. And once you've given it, why didn't we have a boom afterwards? If these things are supposed to be distributed around to a mean of zero, and the shocks got bigger and lasted longer and negative, and there should have been a real boom after 2007, 2008. That is what, for example, is predicted by Ed Lazaire, who was at the time the chief economic advisor to George G.W. Bush. And his prediction in the crux of the crisis in the report to the president of 2008, 2009, predicted by using regressions that because there'd been such a severe shock downwards, there'd be a real boom afterwards. Well, goodbye to that prediction. So all this stuff meant that people who were coping policy really got their worldview shaken, even if they still hang on to their original beliefs. Whereas in academia, exogenous shocks. So there's an extent to which, because academics don't have, as Nassim Taleb will say, don't have skin in the game, they don't get abused by somebody who said, I followed your advice and I stood in front of TV cameras and said this. They get away with it, and they go back into their hovel again, the hovel being microeconomic theory, and emerge again later, with a revised version of the same old core beliefs. Whereas policymakers, Bank of England, Treasuries, OECD, as we're talking here now, there is some residual recognition that something went badly wrong in 2007, and we have to take a slightly different look at things, even if we don't abandon the entire paradigm. So I have more time for the engineers and the so-called scientists in economics.